Lastly, we have the issue of religion. Now, you could be asked a multitude of questions on which created the most tension between Crown and Parliament between this time. And the general three strands that you could be focusing on is the personality of the monarch, the issue of finance, or the issue of religion. Now, under James, James swayed in his treatment of Catholics, so it varied depending completely on the political and social standing in the country at that particular time. So some of the key events and policies under James were, straight away when James came into power in 1603, he ordered Catholics to pay recussancy fines. Now, recussancy fines kind of refers to those who don't adopt the religious line of the monarch that's in power at that particular time, and to be a recussant would be to be like a religious enemy of the states. So any Catholic who refused to adopt James's religious policy had to pay these fines, and that purely isolated the Catholic community as soon as he came into power, with James obviously being quite a devout Protestant. Now, in 1604, James encouraged legislation against Jesuits. Jesuits are Catholic priests who were trained under the Elizabethan era by the papacy and other Catholic nations with which to plot against Elizabeth and remove her from power, either through force or assassination. So legislation carried on under James Stuart's period in order to kind of reduce the Jesuits from firstly entering England, but also to plot against the monarchy. And then obviously the most infamous is the 1605 Gunpowder Plot, which was led by quite well-standing Catholic individuals within society at that particular time. So the ringleaders were publicly executed. So that's obviously Guido Fawkes, or Guy Fawkes as he's now commonly called, and also Robert Aske, A-S-K-E. So those were kind of the two big ringleaders. Robert Aske was the one who kind of instigated the plots and was kind of the mind behind the plots. Guido Fawkes was a Dutch Catholic who obviously wanted to bring down the English monarchy for their interference in the Netherlands with Spain, but also due to the way that not only how Elizabeth but James was treating the Catholics under their monarchy. So he's obviously the one that was discovered in the basement of Parliament. So James, as a consequence of the Gunpowder Plot, introduced the 1606 Oath of Allegiance, which forced Catholics to swear loyalty to the Crown and not the Pope. Bearing in mind, obviously, the Pope is the leadership of the Catholic religion, and that obviously caused a lot of friction between Catholic communities of wanting to stay loyal to their faith versus loyalty to the Crown. So James was a little bit sporadic in his treatment of Catholics. Obviously, when there were plots against him, he treated them very harshly. So Guido Fawkes, for example, was tortured into confession, hung, drawn and quartered upon his execution. But James did not consistently enforce anti-Catholic measures due to a fear of re-antagonising Spain, particularly as he had signed a peace treaty with them when he inherited the throne. So James is quite conscious of being surrounded by Catholic nations, and he doesn't want to antagonise any further conflicts. James is not a fighter. He's an intellect. He'd rather negotiate and educate through literature as opposed to fight wars, unlike his son later on when he inherits the throne in 1625. However, some argue that James was equally hostile towards Puritans in this time period. So Puritans are Protestants that are very extreme. They don't want to kind of adopt any type of Catholic religious policy or tolerance whatsoever. And in 1604, so a year after he comes to power and a year before the Gunpowder Plot, there's this Hampton Court Conference which was held to discuss James's church in response to something the Puritans put together, which is the Millenary Petition. So if you think about the millenarians in a way later on within this unit, it's those types of people that have put together this petition whereby they want to kind of massively reduce Catholic influences within England. So James was willing to listen to Puritan demands, but the only result from the conference was the New English translation of the Bible, and this is known as King James's Bible, which started to be written in 1604 but was not completed until 1611. Likewise, in the same year, Richard Bancroft was made Archbishop of Canterbury. That was one of the most prestigious religious holdings you could have at this time. And he had to ensure that all conformed to James's church, i.e. canon laws. Canon laws are religious laws. So they all had to abide by the new church under James. In practice, this also meant persecuting Puritans who were not willing to adopt the moderate religious line that James wanted to adopt within England. However, as time progresses, James had hoped to follow Elizabeth when it came to religious policy, which meant creating a moderate church, which kind of catered for both Catholics and Protestants. James wasn't particularly hostile towards Catholics, unless, of course, they're trying to blow up Parliament. And whilst dealing with extremism and radicalism, James does not kind of cater at the time of day towards extreme and radical religion. He doesn't want to deal with Jesuits, he doesn't want to deal with Puritans, and any sign of radicalism from either the Protestant or Catholic communities are dealt with quite harshly. And he did this through the support of Arminianism, which was kind of seen as a halfway point in religion, although many Protestants argued that it was catering more towards Catholicism. So James allowed Arminian clerics such as William Laud, who also held the theological debates in court. So that upset many Puritan and Protestant MPs who believed that he was permitting Catholic ideas to creep its way into politics. Likewise, in 1624, James didn't censor Richard Montague's publication of Arminian theology, which Charles also later adopted Montague's ideas. So Laud and Montague are leading Arminianists, if you like, within Europe at this time. Bearing in mind that any type of Protestant literature would have been destroyed under Mary Tudor, any type of Catholic literature would have been destroyed under Edward VI. Henry, depending on what religion he was at the time, destroyed many pieces of literature as well. So censorship isn't something that just exists within Nazi Germany. It also exists within the Tudor and Stuart period, and the previous Tudor monarchs were quite staunch and strict in how they permitted certain literature to be present within England, but James is actually actively allowing this new Arminianism literature to be circulated within England, as well as being debated within court, which proves to be quite unpopular. But with the exception of that, I think it's safe to say that under James's reign, finance proved to be more problematic rather than religion. James was a key Protestant. He was just moderate like Elizabeth and wanted to kind of cater to both religions rather than trying to oust one religion over another one. Because don't forget, he portrays himself as this Rex Pacificus, the peacemaker of Europe. And you can't be a peacemaker if you're wanting to eradicate or deplete a certain group of religious people. So I'd say you can obviously make your own mind up, but I'd say that finance was more of a challenge for James. Charles, though, is a completely different matter, and that could also stem from his personality as well as his marriage and his close confidants, if you like, within government. So Arminians under Charles, were seen as Catholic alliances due to a crossover in particular features between the Arminian religion and Catholic religion. And this was particularly seen to be a Catholic alliance by the Protestant and Puritan communities. So Charles was not in touch with the political nation. Don't forget that he believes in divine right of kings more fiercely than James did. And he believes that he doesn't need to negotiate with Parliament, and therefore his inner circle, such as Buckingham and his wife Henrietta Maria, were deemed to be Catholic or Arminian conspirators who were influencing the king, and they became massively unpopular amongst the political nation, so the nobility and lesser point of the gentry. So Charles's marriage to Henrietta Maria fueled further religious tension due to her Catholic background and the clause over any future heirs they produced. So one of the agreements made under their marriage was that any future heirs they produced were to be educated as Catholics within England, bearing in mind that England is technically meant to be a Protestant nation at this particular time. So not only is it saying that under certain clauses, Catholicism is allowed to be educated to people within England, but it's also saying that inevitably their future heir after Charles dies will be a Catholic monarch, and that becomes very unpopular amongst a Puritan and Protestant court. And then lastly, the York House Conference in 1626 was hosted by Buckingham, so Charles and at a point in time James's closest advisor. And he aired the views on Montagu's work quite openly and took a stance in supporting leading anti-Calvinist William Laud. So Calvinism is a type of Protestantism. They simply believe that God has determined your fate before you're born, as opposed to being able to be rewarded in the afterlife through good deeds, which the Catholics believe in, or simply by praying and believing in your faith, which is what Protestants believe in. So Laud and Montagu are quite openly airing criticisms of branches of the Protestant community, which is why you can kind of understand this hysteria and concern amongst court and parliament about the rise of Catholicism within England. And bearing in mind that Catholicism has not been the state religion since Mary Tudor, and she died in 1558. And obviously, you know, she's famous for a reason of burning Protestants alive, so burning them at the stake, and being very radical in her Catholic ideas. So you can understand why Puritan and Protestant members of the court, of the church, of Parliament are keen to minimise that Catholic influence as much as possible. But we have Buckingham, who is the closest confidant to the monarchy, saying that I'm going to openly support and air the ideas of Montagu and Laud, who criticise Protestant ideas, and he's also married to a Catholic whose children will also be raised as Catholics. So religion becomes more so of an issue under Charles than it does James, but equally, you know, finance and religion are on par with each other in Charles's reign. They both equally cause quite a few concerns, and therefore it's quite ironic really that Charles wants to create a naval and military campaign against France and Spain, given that they are Catholic neighbours and also that connection through his wife. But ultimately you could say finance was a bigger deal under James than religion was. Religion and finance were equally as concerning when we look at the relationship between Crown and Parliament under Charles.